a very terrible person. I'm gonna make sure you never fly again.
Okay, let's all just calm down.
When Diana Coleman ripped that little girl's dress right in front of everyone on Flight 447, she had no idea the 9-year-old watching her every move was Gabriella Ferow, daughter of billionaire tech mogul Alexander Ferow. What happened next changed 5 lives forever. But let me take you back to the beginning of that day, because this story isn't just about a torn dress or a purple hoodie or even about money and power. This is a story about what happens when a lonely little girl with everything meets a terrified little girl with nothing, and how one act of courage on a Tuesday afternoon proved that kindness doesn't cost a thing, but it's worth absolutely everything. Flight 447 from Chicago to Atlanta was scheduled to depart at 2:15 in the afternoon. In seat 2A of first class sat 9-year-old Gabriella Ferow, and if you'd seen her that day, you might have thought she had it all. She was wearing designer jeans, pristine white sneakers that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her favorite purple hoodie covered in silver stars. Her dark curls were pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she had the kind of quiet confidence that comes from growing up in a world where doors open before you even reach them. But here's what you wouldn't have seen. Gabriella was lonely. Desperately, achingly lonely. 6 months earlier, her best friend Emily had moved to London when her father got transferred, and since then Gabriella's world had felt emptier than their 12-bedroom house in the suburbs. Sure, she had tutors and music lessons and every toy and gadget a kid could dream of, but she didn't have what she wanted most. A real friend. Someone who liked her for her, not because her dad was Alexander Ferow, the man whose face had been on the cover of Forbes magazine 3 times. Next to Gabriella sat her father, Alexander Ferow, though everyone in the business world knew him simply as Alex Ferow, the tech genius who'd built a software empire from absolutely nothing. At 42, Alex still carried himself like the foster kid he'd once been, the teenager who'd aged out of the system at 18 with $200 and a bus ticket. He'd slept in his car, worked 3 jobs, taught himself to code in public libraries, and clawed his way to success through pure determination and brilliant ideas. Now his company employed over 10,000 people, but he never forgot what it felt like to be invisible, to be the kid nobody wanted. Across the aisle in seat 2C sat Linda Ferow, Gabriella's mother, and if you'd asked anyone who knew the family, they'd tell you Linda was the heart of it all. At 39, she had the kind of warm, open face that made strangers want to tell her their problems. She'd been a social worker for 12 years before marrying Alex, and they'd met at a youth center where he'd been volunteering, giving coding lessons to kids from the same broken system that had raised him. Linda had walked into that classroom, seen this successful man treating those forgotten teenagers like they mattered, and she'd fallen in love right there. She'd left social work after Gabriella was born, but you can't stop being a social worker, not really. It gets into your bones, that need to help, to fix, to heal. Linda had been carrying a different kind of hurt lately. She and Alex had always talked about having more children, maybe adopting, giving another kid the chance that Alex never had. But time kept passing, and their lives kept getting busier, and that second child remained a dream deferred. Their house felt too big, too quiet, too empty for just 3 people, and Linda felt it most of all. But Gabriella didn't know any of this as she stared out the window that afternoon, watching the ground crew load luggage. She was just a 9-year-old girl who wished she had someone to talk to, someone who understood what it was like to feel invisible even when everyone was looking at you. And that's when she saw her. The little girl looked about 7 years old, maybe younger, with her hair in 2 neat braids tied with yellow ribbons. She was wearing a simple floral dress, the kind that looked handmade, with careful stitches and a hem that had been let down at least once. In her arms, she clutched a worn brown teddy bear like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. And maybe it was. Her name was Doris Williams, and 4 months ago her entire world had ended. Doris's parents, Marcus and Jennifer Williams, had been driving home from her mother's birthday dinner when a drunk driver ran a red light. They died instantly. Doris had been at a sleepover that night, and she'd gone to bed with parents and woken up an orphan. Just like that. One phone call and everything changed. Social services had tried to find relatives. There was only Grandma Vicky, her father's mother, living in Atlanta. Vicky was 74, living on Social Security in a small apartment, but she'd said yes immediately. Of course she'd take her grandbaby. The last time Vicky had seen Doris was 2 years ago, when the distance and money made visits impossible. Now Doris was coming to her, but not the happy, chattering little girl Vicky remembered. This Doris was quiet. This Doris barely spoke. This Doris had stopped drawing, stopped singing, stopped being a child. The floral dress Doris wore had been the last thing her mother made her, sewing it by hand late at night after long shifts at the diner where she'd worked. Jennifer Williams had saved up for that fabric for 3 months, choosing each flower carefully, making sure the colors would make her baby girl smile. Now it was all Doris had left of her mother, and she wore it even though it was getting tight, even though the other kids at the temporary foster home had made fun of its old-fashioned style. She didn't care. When she wore it, she could almost smell her mother's perfume, almost hear her humming while she sewed. Doris was flying as an unaccompanied minor, a term that sounds official and safe but really just means a scared kid traveling alone with a plastic pouch around her neck containing documents and emergency contacts. She'd never been on a plane before. She'd never been away from Chicago before. And she'd certainly never been without her parents before. The teddy bear in her arms was Mr. Buttons, named for the mismatched buttons her father had sewn on his eyes when the original ones fell off. Her dad hadn't known how to sew, not really, but he tried, and the crooked stitches made Doris love that bear even more. Now Mr. Buttons was all she had of her father, and she held him so tight her knuckles were white. As Doris walked down the jet bridge, her heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. The social worker, a tired woman named Mrs. Patterson, had walked her to security, handed her off to an airline representative, and that was it. Doris was alone. She wanted to cry, but she'd learned that crying made the adults uncomfortable, so she bit her lip and kept walking. And that's when she met Diana Coleman. Diana Coleman had been a flight attendant for 10 years, and every single one of those years had made her more bitter. She'd started this job with dreams, you know? She'd wanted to travel, see the world, meet interesting people. Instead, she spent her days serving drinks to rude businessmen and cleaning up after families who treated her like she was invisible. She'd applied for supervisor positions 3 times. 3 times she'd been passed over for younger attendants with brighter smiles and fewer complaints. The unfairness of it had curdled something inside Diana, turned her sour in a way she didn't even fully recognize anymore. Diana had learned to smile for first-class passengers, the ones who could complain to corporate, the ones who mattered. But economy? Economy passengers got her tolerance, nothing more. And children flying alone? They were just extra paperwork, extra responsibility, extra annoyance. When Diana saw Doris standing in the galley, clutching that ratty teddy bear and looking terrified, she felt nothing but irritation. Another unaccompanied minor. Another kid who'd probably cry or make a mess or need constant attention. Gabriella watched through the gap in the curtain as Diana took Doris's documents, barely glancing at the little girl's face. She watched as Diana grabbed Doris's arm, not gently, and steered her down the aisle toward the economy section. Doris stumbled a little and Diana didn't slow down. She just kept walking, dragging this tiny, scared child like she was luggage. Something twisted in Gabriella's chest. She turned to her mother. "Mom, who's that little girl? Why is she alone?" Linda followed her daughter's gaze and saw Doris being deposited into seat 23B, still clutching Mr. Buttons, looking like she might shatter into a million pieces. "She's an unaccompanied minor, sweetheart. That means she's flying by herself. The airline takes care of her until she gets to whoever's meeting her. But she looks so scared. Why is she alone? Where are her parents?" Linda's social worker instincts kicked in. She could see the signs, the body language, the grief sitting on that child's shoulders like a weight. "I don't know, baby. Sometimes kids have to travel alone for different reasons. Maybe her parents are already where she's going." But Gabriella, who was wise beyond her 9 years, who noticed everything, shook her head. "I don't think so, Mom. Look at her. She's not excited. She's terrified." And Gabriella was right. In row 23, Doris pressed herself against the window, making herself as small as possible, trying to disappear. She didn't want anyone to notice her. She just wanted to get through this flight, get to Grandma Vicky, and maybe feel safe again. Then Diana returned to first class, and it was like watching someone put on a mask. The harsh expression melted away, replaced by a bright, professional smile. She approached the Ferow family with the kind of deference reserved for people who fly first class, people who matter. "Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Ferow. Welcome aboard. Can I get you anything before we take off? Champagne? Orange juice for the young lady?" Linda smiled politely and requested water. Alexander, buried in his laptop, barely looked up. But Gabriella watched Diana carefully. She watched the way Diana's smile didn't reach her eyes. She watched the way Diana's voice changed, became warmer, friendlier. And she remembered how that same woman had just dragged Doris down the aisle like she didn't matter at all. The plane began to fill. Business travelers in suits, families with strollers, college kids with backpacks. The overhead bins slammed shut. The safety demonstration began. And through it all, Gabriella couldn't stop thinking about the little girl in row 23. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began to taxi, Gabriella craned her neck, trying to see through the gap in the curtain. And then she saw it. Doris, pressed against the window, tears streaming silently down her face. Not sobbing, not making a sound, just crying the way children cry when they've learned that no one's coming to comfort them anyway. Gabriella's heart broke. She'd felt lonely before. She'd felt sad when Emily moved away. But she'd never felt alone, not really. She'd always had her parents, her home, her safety. This little girl had nothing. No parents sitting next to her, no one holding her hand during takeoff, no one telling her it was going to be okay. "Mom," Gabriella whispered urgently. "Mom, look. The little girl is crying." Linda looked and her professional mask cracked. She'd seen so many children cry in her years as a social worker, but it never got easier. She reached over and squeezed Gabriella's hand. "I see her, baby. That's really hard to see, isn't it? Can't we help her? Can't we do something?" Alexander finally looked up from his laptop, sensing the urgency in his daughter's voice. He followed their gaze to economy, saw Doris crying silently, and something old and buried stirred in his chest. He knew that loneliness. He'd lived it. He'd been that scared kid once, traveling alone, crying in the dark, wondering if anyone would ever choose him. The plane lifted off the ground, Chicago falling away below them, and Gabriella couldn't look away from Doris. She watched as the little girl pressed her face against Mr. Button's, her whole body shaking with silent sobs. And in that moment, Gabriella Ferow, who had everything money could buy but no one to share it with, made a decision. She didn't know what she was going to do yet. But she knew she couldn't just sit in first class and do nothing while that little girl suffered alone. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button because what happens next will restore your faith in humanity. This story is just getting started and you won't believe where it goes. And I want to ask you something. Have you ever seen someone struggling and felt that pull to help, even when it wasn't convenient? Drop a comment and let me know, because that's exactly what 9-year-old Gabriella was feeling as Flight 447 climbed to cruising altitude, carrying 5 people whose lives were about to intersect in the most unexpected way. What Gabriella didn't know was that in just 30 minutes, she'd witnessed something that would change everything. Diana Coleman was about to show her true colors, Doris was about to experience her worst moment on that plane, and Gabriella was about to find the courage she didn't know she had. Because sometimes the most important moments in our lives start with the simplest decision: to care when it would be easier to look away. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and for most passengers on Flight 447, the journey had settled into that familiar rhythm of airplane travel. Laptops opened. Headphones went in. Flight attendants rolled carts down the aisle offering drinks and snacks. It was just another Tuesday afternoon flight from Chicago to Atlanta. But Gabriella Ferow couldn't relax. She sat in seat 2A, her purple star-covered hoodie bunched up against the window, and she kept looking back toward economy. She couldn't see Doris clearly anymore, just glimpses through the narrow gap in the curtain, but she couldn't stop thinking about those silent tears, that worn teddy bear, that handmade floral dress. Linda noticed her daughter's distraction. "Gabriella, honey, are you okay? You haven't touched your juice." "I'm fine, Mom," Gabriella said, but her eyes stayed fixed on that curtain. 30 minutes into the flight, the beverage service reached economy class. Diana Coleman pushed her cart down the aisle with mechanical efficiency, that practiced smile plastered on her face, though anyone paying attention would notice it never warmed her eyes. When she reached row 23, she didn't even look at Doris. "Drink?" The word came out flat, bored. Doris, who'd been trying so hard to be invisible, so hard not to be a bother, barely whispered, "Apple juice, please?" Diana grabbed a small plastic cup, filled it halfway, not all the way like she'd done for other passengers, and set it on Doris's tray table with just a little too much force. A few drops sloshed over the rim. "There. Anything else?" "No, thank you." Doris's voice was so quiet Diana had to lean in to hear it, and the effort of leaning in seemed to irritate her further. Diana moved on, and Doris carefully lifted the cup with both hands. Her hands were small and they were shaking slightly. Whether from nerves or from the turbulence that had started to make the plane shudder, or from the fact that she'd been crying for 30 minutes straight, we'll never know. But what happened next was simply an accident. The kind of accident that happens to children every single day. The kind of accident that should be met with kindness and understanding. The plane hit a bump. Not a big one, just enough to jostle everything slightly. And the cup in Doris's small, shaking hands tipped forward. Apple juice splashed across her tray table, a few drops hitting her precious floral dress, and Doris gasped in horror. "Oh no, oh no, oh no." She grabbed napkins frantically, trying to clean it up, tears already forming in her eyes. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to." She was talking to no one, apologizing to the air, to her mother's dress, to the universe that kept punishing her for simply existing. Diana heard the commotion and turned around. When she saw the spilled juice, something dark flashed across her face. Here was the excuse she'd been waiting for, the justification for the irritation she'd felt since the moment this child had boarded her flight. She strode back to row 23, and her voice cut through the quiet murmur of the plane like ice. Of course you did. Some children just don't know how to behave on airplanes. The words landed like slaps. Every passenger within earshot turned to look. Doris froze, napkins clutched in her small hands, apple juice dripping onto her lap, her face crumpling. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, the plane moved and I'm so sorry, please, I'm sorry. Diana made a great show of sighing, rolling her eyes, pulling out a towel from her cart with exaggerated slowness. She wiped the tray table with sharp, angry movements, her whole body language screaming annoyance, inconvenience, burden. This is why children shouldn't fly alone. You create messes and expect everyone else to clean them up. I'll clean it, I'm sorry. Doris was sobbing now, trying to help, but Diana waved her away. Just sit still. You've done enough. The man in row 24, a businessman in his 50s, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd watched the whole thing, seen how the turbulence had caused the spill, seen that it was clearly an accident. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it. Not his business. Not his problem. The elderly woman in row 22 frowned, shaking her head in disapproval, but she too said nothing. And this is the tragedy we don't talk about enough. Good people staying silent while cruelty happens right in front of them. Not because they're bad people, but because speaking up is uncomfortable. Because confrontation is hard. Because we've all been taught to mind our own business, to not make waves, to let authority figures handle things. But in first class, Gabriella Ferow was watching through that gap in the curtain, and she was not staying silent in her heart. Mom, Gabriella's voice was tight with anger. Mom, did you see that? Linda had been reading a magazine, but something in her daughter's tone made her put it down immediately. See what, sweetheart? That flight attendant. She was so mean to the little girl. She spilled some juice by accident and the lady was so mean. Linda looked through the curtain, saw Diana finishing up, saw Doris pressed back against the window, crying into Mr. Buttons. Oh honey, that does look harsh. But sometimes flight attendants have to be firm with children, especially ones traveling alone. But Mom, Gabriella's voice rose slightly, she wasn't being firm, she was being mean. There's a difference. Alexander looked up from his laptop, finally tuning into the conversation. What's going on? Gabriella pointed toward economy. That flight attendant was really rude to that little girl we saw earlier. She spilled some juice and the lady made her feel terrible about it. Alexander glanced back, saw Diana walking away, saw Doris crying. He saw it, registered it, and then his years of not wanting to make waves, of picking his battles, of focusing on what he could control, kicked in. Sweetheart, flight attendants have tough jobs. They deal with difficult passengers all day. Maybe that little girl had been acting up earlier, and this was just the last straw. Gabriella turned to her father, and there was something in her eyes that made Alexander pause. It was disappointment. His 9-year-old daughter was disappointed in him. Dad, she's 7 years old and she's flying alone and she's terrified. She wasn't acting up. She had an accident. And that lady was cruel. The word cruel hung in the air. Linda reached over and squeezed Gabriella's hand. You're right that it looked harsh, baby. Your father's right too that we don't know the whole situation. But I can see why it upset you. You have a good heart. Gabriella turned back to the window, but her jaw was set in a way Linda recognized. That was Gabriella's stubborn face. The face she made when she decided something was wrong and needed to be fixed. Linda had seen that face when Gabriella was 5 and had insisted they donate half her birthday presents to a children's shelter. She'd seen it when Gabriella was 7 and had organized a lemonade stand to raise money for animal rescue. And she was seeing it now. Linda exchanged a glance with Alexander. Our daughter is not going to let this go. Alexander nodded slightly and went back to his laptop, but he wasn't really reading anymore. He was thinking about being 12 years old in his 4th foster home, spilling milk at dinner, and having the foster mother scream at him in front of the whole family. He was thinking about how small that had made him feel. How worthless. How much like a burden. He shook his head trying to focus on work. But the memory wouldn't leave. The flight continued. The turbulence settled down. The seatbelt sign turned off. Passengers got up to stretch, to use the restroom, to grab bags from overhead compartments. Diana returned to the galley, chatting with another flight attendant, laughing about something, her cruelty already forgotten. But Doris sat in row 23, her dress damp with apple juice, her face wet with tears, and she didn't move. She was afraid to move. Afraid to do anything that might draw attention, might cause another accident, might make that terrible woman come back. An hour into the flight, Doris's bladder was screaming at her. She'd needed to use the bathroom for 20 minutes now, but she'd been too scared to get up. What if she did something wrong again? What if she made that lady angry? What if she caused more trouble? But biology doesn't care about fear. Eventually the need became desperate. Doris unbuckled her seatbelt during a calm moment, stood up on shaky legs and took a step toward the aisle. And that's when Diana materialized, like she'd been waiting for Doris to do something wrong. Sit down immediately. Diana's voice cracked like a whip. Did I give you permission to move? Doris froze, one hand still on her seat back. I need to use the bathroom. The seatbelt sign is on. Diana pointed upward, even though the sign was clearly off. You need to wait. But it's off, I saw it turn off, I really need to. Doris's voice was desperate now, pleading. You should have thought of that before. Diana's voice was cold, dismissive. Wait until I tell you it's safe to move. But Doris couldn't wait. She was 7 years old and she'd been holding it for 20 minutes and she was at that point where waiting even another minute felt impossible. Please, I really need to go. The desperation in her voice would have moved anyone with an ounce of compassion. Diana had no compassion left. Not for this child. Not today. I said sit down. We'll let you know when you can move. Doris sat, tears flowing freely now, and for the next 10 minutes she experienced a special kind of torture. The kind where your body is screaming at you but you're trapped, powerless, afraid. She watched the seconds tick by on the screen in front of her. She squeezed Mr. Buttons so hard his seam started to strain. She bit her lip until it almost bled. Those 10 minutes felt like hours. Finally, the turbulence that had never actually required the seatbelt sign in the first place, the turbulence that Diana had lied about, subsided completely. Diana made a show of checking with the cockpit, and then, with exaggerated reluctance, announced that passengers could move about the cabin. Doris didn't wait. She couldn't. She shot out of her seat and rushed toward the bathroom at the front of economy, moving as fast as her little legs could carry her, desperate, nearly in tears from the sheer relief of finally being allowed to go. She didn't see Diana step into the narrow aisle. She didn't see Diana position her service cart at just the right angle. She didn't see the calculating look in Diana's eyes. But Gabriella saw it all. Gabriella had been watching. She'd seen Diana tell Doris to sit down. She'd seen the 10 minutes of torture. She'd seen Doris's desperate rush to the bathroom. And she saw, with perfect clarity, Diana deliberately step into Doris's path, positioning her cart so that the metal corner jutted into the aisle at exactly the height of a 7-year-old's shoulder. It happened in slow motion and all at once. Doris rushed past. The floral fabric of her dress, the precious handmade dress her mother had sewn with love and care and hope, caught on the sharp corner of the cart. The sound of tearing fabric echoed through the economy cabin, a sound that made everyone within hearing distance wince. The dress ripped from shoulder to waist, a devastating tear that exposed Doris's undershirt, that destroyed the careful stitching, that ripped away the last physical connection to her mother. Doris stumbled, caught herself on the armrest of row 20, and looked down at her dress in absolute horror. The tear was huge. Irreparable. The flowers her mother had chosen so carefully were now separated by a gaping wound in the fabric. And then Diana began her performance. Oh my goodness. Her voice was loud, shocked, concerned, all the things she hadn't been when Doris spilled juice. You need to be more careful. Look what you've done to your dress. Other passengers turned to look. They saw a flight attendant looking concerned. They saw a little girl who'd apparently run into a cart. They saw what Diana wanted them to see. But they didn't see what had really happened. They didn't see the deliberate step into the aisle. They didn't see the calculated positioning of the cart. They didn't see the cruelty. Doris couldn't form words. She was looking at her dress, at the destruction of the last piece of her mother she had, and her whole body was shaking. You were running. You need to walk on airplanes, young lady. Look what happens when you don't follow the rules. Diana shook her head, making sure her performance reached the passengers around them. Doris stood there, exposed, humiliated, destroyed, and Diana made no move to help her. No offer of a blanket. No gentle words. Nothing. She just stood there, shaking her head in disapproval, letting this child suffer. The businessman in row 24 had seen more this time. He'd seen Diana step into the aisle. He'd seen the deliberate nature of it. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then spoke quietly. Excuse me, but I think the cart was blocking the aisle. Diana turned to him with a sweet smile. Oh sir, children need to be more careful. She was running. But thank you for your concern. The dismissal was clear. The businessman wanted to push back, wanted to say more, but Diana had already turned away, and he didn't have the courage to escalate. So he stayed silent, and he'd regret that silence later. The elderly woman from row 22 had seen it too. She'd seen everything. And unlike the businessman, she wasn't going to stay quiet. "I saw what happened, miss." The woman's voice was firm. "You stepped into her path. That child wasn't running. She was walking and you blocked her." Diana's mask slipped for just a moment, annoyance flashing across her face, before the professional smile returned. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I know what happened. This child needs to be more careful." But the seed had been planted. Other passengers were murmuring now, questioning, wondering. Had the flight attendant really stepped into the child's path? Had that been deliberate? Doris heard none of it. She was crying too hard, her whole body racked with sobs, trying desperately to hold the torn fabric together, to cover herself, to somehow make this not be happening. She still needed to use the bathroom. Her bladder was still screaming. But now she was also exposed, humiliated, and grief-stricken. She stumbled into the bathroom and locked the door, and the sound of her sobbing could be heard by everyone in the surrounding rows. In first class, Gabriella stood up so fast her seat belt clicked against the armrest. Linda immediately put a hand on her daughter's arm. "Gabriella, where are you going?" Gabriella's voice shook with fury. "That lady hurt her on purpose, Mom. I saw it." She stepped into the aisle and her cart ripped that little girl's dress, and she's not even helping her, she's just standing there blaming her. Alexander looked up sharply. "Gabriella, sit down. You can't just march back there and—" But Gabriella was already unbuckling, already standing, already done with sitting quietly while injustice happened. Alexander stood too, reaching for his daughter. "Gabriella, you can't just—" "I can and I am." Gabriella's voice was firm in a way her parents had never heard before. "That lady hurt her on purpose and everyone saw it and nobody's doing anything, and that's wrong." Linda and Alexander exchanged glances. Their 9-year-old daughter was about to confront an adult flight attendant, about to walk into a situation they didn't fully understand, about to do something that could go very wrong in a lot of ways. But they also saw something else in their daughter's eyes. They saw conviction. They saw courage. They saw the kind of moral clarity that adults spend lifetimes trying to recapture. And they saw themselves. Alexander, who'd built an empire on refusing to accept injustice. Linda, who'd spent 12 years fighting for vulnerable children. How could they tell their daughter to sit down when she was doing exactly what they'd spent their lives teaching her to do? Stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. Linda made the decision first. She stood up. "Then I'm coming with you." Alexander closed his laptop. "Then we all are." But Gabriella was already walking. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She'd never directly confronted an adult before, not like this, not when she knew she was about to make them angry, not when she knew they might yell at her or tell her to mind her own business. Every rule she'd ever been taught about respecting adults, about not making scenes, about being polite and quiet and good, was screaming at her to turn around, to sit down, to let the grown-ups handle it. But something in Doris's eyes, in that moment when her dress tore, in the absolute devastation on that little girl's face, made Gabriella forget every single one of those rules. She pushed through the curtain separating first class from economy. Diana was still standing in the aisle, talking to another flight attendant now, completely unconcerned about the sobbing child locked in the bathroom. Other passengers were settling back down, the moment passing, the drama over. But it wasn't over. Not for Gabriella Ferow. It was just beginning. 9-year-old Gabriella Ferow had never directly confronted an adult before. She'd been raised to be polite, to respect authority, to trust that grown-ups knew best. But something in Doris's eyes made her forget every rule about respecting your elders. Because sometimes respect has to be earned. And sometimes the most respectful thing a child can do is refuse to respect cruelty. Gabriella walked down the aisle of economy class, her purple star-covered hoodie bright against the dull airplane interior, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides, her whole body trembling with a combination of fear and righteous anger. She walked past the businessman in row 24, who looked at her with surprise and something like shame. She walked past the elderly woman in row 22, who gave her an encouraging nod. She walked past a dozen passengers who'd witnessed what happened and stayed silent. And she walked right up to Diana Coleman, looked up at the woman who towered over her, and prepared to do the hardest thing she'd ever done in her 9 years of life. Speak truth to power. If you're wondering what a 9-year-old girl said to a grown woman who just deliberately hurt a helpless child, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next is going to blow your mind. And I want to know, have you ever had to stand up to someone older or more powerful than you to do the right thing? How did it feel? Drop your story in the comments because Gabriella is about to learn exactly how terrifying and necessary that courage can be. The bathroom door was still closed. Doris was still crying. Diana was still smiling. And Gabriella Ferow was about to change everything. Gabriella Ferow walked down that economy aisle like she was walking into battle. Her parents were somewhere behind her, she could hear her mother's heels clicking on the floor, her father's deeper footsteps, but she didn't wait for them. She couldn't wait. Because Doris was still in that bathroom, still crying, still alone, and every second that passed felt like a betrayal. The bathroom door was closed, but the sound of sobbing leaked through it, thin and broken and absolutely devastating. Gabriella stopped right in front of it and knocked gently. "Doris? My name is Gabriella. Can you come out? I want to help you." The sobbing paused. There was a long moment of silence and then the lock clicked. The door opened a crack and Doris's tear-stained face appeared. When she saw Gabriella, 9 years old, standing there with compassion in her eyes instead of judgment, something in her crumpled all over again. Doris stumbled out of the bathroom and Gabriella could see the full extent of the damage now. The dress, that beautiful floral dress with its careful stitches and let-down hem, was torn from shoulder to waist. The fabric hung open, exposing Doris's thin white undershirt, and Doris was trying desperately to hold the pieces together with her tiny hands. But there was too much fabric and her hands were too small, and she couldn't cover everything. She looked mortified, exposed, destroyed. Gabriella's heart, which had already been breaking for this child, shattered completely. "Hi, I'm Gabriella." That looked like it really hurt. It was such a simple thing to say. Not pity. Not condescension. Just acknowledgement. That looked like it hurt. Because it had hurt. It had hurt in ways that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with dignity and loss and the last connection to a mother who would never sew another dress. Doris tried to speak, but all that came out was a choked sob. She nodded instead, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking. And that's when Diana Coleman made her second critical mistake of the day. Her first mistake had been underestimating the courage of a 7-year-old orphan. Her second mistake was underestimating the fury of a 9-year-old girl who just witnessed injustice. Diana appeared behind Gabriella, her face no longer wearing that professional mask. Now it showed irritation, annoyance, the face of someone who was done pretending. "Little girl, return to your seat. This doesn't concern you." Her voice was sharp, dismissive, the voice of an adult who expected immediate obedience simply because she was an adult. The voice of someone who'd learned that children were supposed to be seen and not heard, and definitely not supposed to challenge authority. But Gabriella Ferow had been raised by a father who'd built an empire by questioning authority and a mother who'd spent her career advocating for people who had no voice. Obedience for obedience's sake had never been a value in the Ferow household. Doing what was right even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, that was the value. Gabriella turned to face Diana and she didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She didn't look down. She looked Diana Coleman directly in the eyes, this woman who was 3 times her age and twice her height, and she spoke with a calm clarity that made several nearby passengers sit up straighter. "I saw what happened. You stepped into her way. The cart caught her dress." The accusation hung in the air, clear and damning. Diana's face hardened. Her eyes went cold. When she spoke, her voice had an edge that would have made most children cry. "I did no such thing. This child was running wild and had an accident. Now return to your seat before you cause more trouble." But Gabriella had seen the lie. She'd watched the whole thing happen. She'd seen Diana deliberately step into the aisle, position that cart at exactly the right angle, time it perfectly for when Doris rushed past. And Gabriella had been raised to believe that lying was wrong, that truth mattered, that silence in the face of injustice was complicity. So she didn't return to her seat. She didn't back down. She spoke 3 words that changed everything. "That's not true." 3 words. Simple. Clear. Undeniable. Other passengers were watching now. The businessman in row 24 had put down his phone. The elderly woman in row 22 had turned completely around in her seat. A young mother across the aisle was holding her toddler closer, watching this confrontation unfold. The college student in row 21 had taken out his earbuds. Everyone was watching a 9-year-old girl call a grown woman a liar. Diana felt the weight of all those eyes, and something shifted in her demeanor. The professional mask was gone. The fake politeness was gone. What remained was the bitter, angry woman who'd been passed over for promotions, who resented her job, who took out her frustrations on people she deemed beneath her. She leaned down, bringing her face close to Gabriella's, and her voice dropped to a low, threatening hiss that only Gabriella and Doris could fully hear. Your parents paid for first-class seats. I suggest you return to them before I have the captain informed of a disturbance. We don't tolerate children who cause problems on this aircraft. It was a threat. Clear and direct. Do what I say or there will be consequences. The kind of threat that works on most children because most children are taught that adults are always right, that defying them brings punishment, that causing a scene is the worst thing you can do. But Gabriella Ferow was not most children. She stood her ground, her hands clenched at her sides, her voice steady even though her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. My dad owns a company with 10,000 employees. He says people who lie always get caught eventually. The temperature in that aisle seemed to drop 10 degrees. Gabriella hadn't said it as a brag. She hadn't said it to show off or intimidate. She'd said it as a simple statement of fact, a reminder that actions have consequences, that lies have a way of coming to light, that cruelty doesn't go unpunished just because you have authority. But Diana heard it as a threat. And maybe it was. Because Alexander Ferow did own a company with 10,000 employees. He did have resources. He did have lawyers. And he did have a very long memory for injustice. Diana straightened up, her face flushed with anger and the first stirrings of fear. She opened her mouth to respond, to put this child in her place, to reassert her authority. But Gabriella had already turned away from her. She turned back to Doris, who was still standing there trying to hold her dress together, still crying, still looking like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. And Gabriella, without a word, without hesitation, reached down and grabbed the hem of her purple hoodie with the silver stars. She pulled it up over her head in one smooth motion, her dark curls getting staticky from the fabric, and she held it out to Doris. Here. You can wear this. It's warm and it'll cover your dress. Doris looked at the hoodie like Gabriella was offering her the crown jewels. Her eyes went wide. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. She looked at the hoodie, at Gabriella, at the hoodie again. I can't, she finally whispered. It's too nice. I'll ruin it. I'll get it dirty. I can't. Her voice was so small, so defeated, so convinced that she didn't deserve kindness, that she would somehow contaminate anything good that touched her life. Gabriella shook her head, and when she smiled, it was the kind of smile that could melt ice. It's just a hoodie. I have like 15 at home. Besides, purple looks better on you. It was perfect. Not pitying. Not condescending. Just one kid helping another kid like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like Doris deserved help, deserved kindness, deserved to be seen and valued. Gabriella stepped closer and helped Doris put the hoodie on. Doris's arms were so thin they looked like they might snap. The hoodie was oversized on Gabriella, so on Doris's tiny 7-year-old frame, it was enormous. It swallowed her completely, the sleeves hanging past her hands, the hem reaching almost to her knees. But it covered the tear in her dress completely. It was warm. It was soft. And it smelled like vanilla and lavender, like Gabriella's house, like safety and home and everything Doris hadn't felt in 4 months. Doris pulled the hoodie tight around herself, and for the first time since her parents died, she felt something other than cold, empty grief. She felt cared for. She felt seen. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone in the world. She managed a small smile through her tears, the first real smile she'd smiled in months. Thank you, she whispered. Gabriella smiled back. What's your name? Doris Williams. I'm Gabriella Ferow. Can I sit with you? It was such a simple question, but it meant everything. Can I sit with you? Can I be your friend? Can we be together instead of alone? Doris's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. She nodded frantically, unable to speak through the sudden surge of hope. But Diana Coleman was not about to let this rebellion continue. Absolutely not. Her voice cut through the moment like scissors through silk. Assigned seating must be maintained. Return to your seat immediately. Gabriella didn't even look at her. She was done with Diana Coleman. She'd said what needed to be said, and now Diana was simply an obstacle to be worked around. There's an empty seat right next to her. I'll sit there. She said it matter-of-factly, like it was already decided, like Diana's approval was unnecessary and irrelevant. Diana's face went red. That's not how this works. You cannot simply change seats because you want to. There are rules, there are procedures, there are. And that's when Linda Ferow appeared in the aisle, and her voice was calm and pleasant and absolutely terrifying in its politeness. Is there a problem here? Diana spun around and the transformation was instant. The angry, bitter woman vanished. The professional mask slammed back into place. The smile returned, though it was strained at the edges. Mrs. Ferow. Your daughter has left her assigned seat. I was just explaining to her that we have seating assignments for a reason, and she needs to return to first class immediately. Linda looked at her daughter, at Doris wrapped in Gabriella's hoodie, at the torn dress visible beneath it, at the tears on both girls' faces. And Linda Ferow, who'd spent 12 years as a social worker and could read a situation faster than most people could blink, knew exactly what had happened here. Mom, Gabriella's voice was urgent, desperate to be believed. She ripped Doris's dress on purpose and then blamed her. I saw it. She stepped into the aisle and the cart caught Doris's dress and tore it, and she didn't even help her. She just blamed her for running when she wasn't running. She was just trying to get to the bathroom. The words tumbled out in a rush, and Linda listened to every single one, her social worker brain cataloging details, assessing credibility, reading body language. Then Alexander Ferow appeared behind his wife, and if Linda's calm politeness was terrifying, Alexander's quiet intensity was apocalyptic. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply looked at Diana Coleman, then at Doris Williams, then back at Diana, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet everyone had to strain to hear it. What happened to this child's dress? Diana's professional smile was starting to crack at the edges. An unfortunate accident, sir. She was running through the cabin and caught her dress on my service cart. I've already explained to her that she needs to walk, not run, on aircraft. Her voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of someone who'd told this lie several times already and expected it to be believed because she was an adult in uniform, and children, especially children like Doris, were always assumed to be at fault. But before Alexander could respond, a small voice, barely audible, spoke up. I wasn't running. I was walking to the bathroom. Doris's voice was so quiet, so scared, but it was there. She was speaking up. She was contradicting an adult. She was doing something she'd never done before, and her whole body was shaking with the effort. Linda immediately knelt down to Doris's level, putting herself at eye height with this terrified child, and her voice was so gentle it made several passengers' eyes water. Sweetheart, are you traveling alone? Doris nodded, unable to speak anymore, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Linda's social worker instincts were screaming now. Unaccompanied minor. Torn clothing. Obvious distress. Flight attendant being defensive. This was bad. This was very bad. She reached out slowly, telegraphing her movements so as not to scare Doris, and gently touched the purple hoodie. Is this yours? Doris shook her head. Gabriella gave it to me. My dress got torn and she gave me her hoodie. Linda looked at her daughter with such pride it was almost painful. Then she noticed the worn teddy bear clutched in Doris's other hand, the mismatched button eyes, the threadbare fur. What's your bear's name? Mr. Buttons. My dad made him. Made him? Fixed him. The eyes fell off and my dad sewed on buttons. Doris's voice broke. He wasn't good at sewing, but he tried really hard. Past tense. Linda caught it immediately. Where's your dad now, sweetheart? But before Doris could answer, the businessman from row 24 stood up. He was a tall man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit, and he'd been sitting on his conscience for the last 10 minutes and he was done. I saw the whole thing. His voice was loud, clear, meant to carry. The attendant stepped into the girl's path. It wasn't an accident. The cart was positioned deliberately. The child was walking, not running. And this isn't the first time this attendant has been cruel to her. She's been awful to this child since boarding. The elderly woman from row 22 stood up next, her white hair perfectly styled, her eyes sharp and angry. I saw it too. That woman, she pointed directly at Diana, has been treating this poor child terribly from the moment she got on this plane. The spilled juice earlier? The child apologized repeatedly and this woman made her feel like dirt. And what just happened? That was deliberate. That was cruel. And I won't stay silent about it. Other passengers started murmuring, nodding, agreeing. A young mother spoke up. I saw her refuse to let the child use the bathroom even though the seatbelt sign was off. The little girl was clearly desperate. The college student pulled out his phone. I recorded part of it. The part where you told her she couldn't get up even though the sign was clearly off. Diana's face went from red to pale white. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. She'd been so sure she could control the narrative, so confident that her word as an adult, as a uniformed authority figure, would trump the testimony of a 7-year-old orphan. But she'd forgotten something crucial. She'd forgotten that cruelty witnessed is cruelty remembered. She'd forgotten that in the age of camera phones and social media, nothing stays hidden. She'd forgotten that sometimes, just sometimes, people do the right thing. Alexander's voice, when it came, was dangerously quiet. Every word was precisely enunciated, The voice of a man who'd learned to control his anger because uncontrolled anger was a luxury foster kids couldn't afford. Is this true? Diana's professional mask was in shreds now. She looked around at all the passengers staring at her, at the Ferows, at Doris crying silently, at Gabriella standing protectively next to her new friend. These passengers are mistaken. I would never deliberately harm a child. I have been a flight attendant for 10 years. I have an exemplary record. This child had an accident because she wasn't following the rules, and now everyone is rushing to blame me because you're lying. Gabriella's voice cut through Diana's excuses like a knife. I watched you. You stepped into the aisle on purpose. You positioned the cart on purpose. You hurt her on purpose. Linda stood up from her kneeling position, and when she looked at Diana Coleman, it was with the eyes of every social worker who'd ever had to document abuse, who'd ever had to fight for a child, who'd ever had to stand between cruelty and innocence. Doris, she said softly, keeping her eyes on the flight attendant. Where are your parents? And that was the question that broke everything wide open. Doris looked up at Linda with those huge, grief-filled eyes, clutching Mr. Buttons so tight her knuckles were white, wearing Gabriella's oversized purple hoodie, and she tried to speak but all that came out was a sob. She tried again. They died. 2 words. Simple. Devastating. The entire economy section went silent. People who'd been murmuring stopped. People who'd been getting out their phones to record froze. Everyone was looking at this tiny 7-year-old girl who just dropped a bomb of grief into the middle of their Tuesday afternoon flight. Doris couldn't stop now. The dam had broken. For months of holding it together, of being brave, of not crying too much because it made the foster parents uncomfortable, of trying to be good and quiet and not a burden, all of it came pouring out. I'm going to live with my grandma Vicky. I miss my mom. I miss my dad. And I just wanted to go to the bathroom and now my dress is ruined and it's the last thing my mom made me and I have nothing left of her and her voice rose with each word, climbing toward hysteria, toward that edge where grief becomes too big for a small body to contain. She made it for me, she sewed every flower, she let the hem down twice because I kept growing, and it was the last thing she made before the accident, and now it's ruined and I don't have anything left of her, I don't have anything at all. Complete breakdown. Doris collapsed into sobs so violent they shook her whole body. She couldn't stand anymore. She couldn't hold Mr. Buttons. She couldn't do anything except cry with the kind of abandon that only comes when you've lost everything and one more loss, even a dress, is unbearable. The entire economy section was silent. Completely, utterly silent. The kind of silence that happens when people collectively witness something that breaks their hearts. The businessman from row 24 was crying. The elderly woman from row 22 had her hand over her mouth. The young mother was holding her toddler close, tears streaming down her face. The college student had put his phone away, forgotten because some moments are too sacred to record. Linda Ferow didn't hesitate. She swept Doris into her arms and held her tight, rocking her like she was her own child, making soft shushing sounds, letting this little girl sob into her shoulder. It's okay, sweetheart. It's okay. You're safe now. I've got you. You're safe. Alexander stood frozen, watching his wife comfort this devastated child, and something inside him cracked wide open. He was 12 again in his 4th foster home, being told he was too much trouble, being told he'd have to move again, being told that nobody wanted a kid like him. He was 15, aging out of the system, terrified and alone. He was 18, sleeping in his car, wondering if anyone would ever choose him. He looked at Doris and saw himself. Different circumstances, different era, but the same fundamental wound. Abandoned. Alone. Convinced that she was somehow at fault for her own suffering. Gabriella stood next to them, one small hand on Doris's back, and she was crying too, but silently, not wanting to make this about her but unable to hold back the tears. And Diana Coleman realized, finally, that she was in serious trouble. She looked around at the passengers staring at her with disgust and fury. She looked at the college student who'd recorded her refusing to let Doris use the bathroom. She looked at Alexander Ferow, billionaire tech mogul, whose lawyers could destroy her career with a phone call. She looked at Linda Ferow, who was comforting the child Diana had tormented, and who clearly had the maternal instincts Diana lacked. She looked at Doris, this orphan child whose dress she'd deliberately destroyed, whose grief she'd compounded, whose trauma she'd made worse because she'd been having a bad day and needed someone to take it out on. And she realized with dawning horror that everything she'd worked for, her 10-year career, her livelihood, her reputation, all of it was about to come crashing down because she'd chosen cruelty over kindness, power over compassion, her own anger over a child's dignity. If this story is breaking your heart, hit that subscribe button because what happens next will restore your faith in humanity. The Ferow family is about to make a decision that will change Doris's life forever. And I want to know, have you ever witnessed someone stand up for a stranger who needed help? Share your story in the comments because we need more reminders that courage and kindness still exist in this world. Doris was still crying in Linda's arms, but the sobs were quieter now, exhausted. Gabriella was still standing guard, protective, fierce, this 9-year-old warrior who'd done what a dozen adults had been too afraid to do. And somewhere in the front of the plane, a call was being made to the head flight attendant, to the captain, to corporate, because what Diana Coleman had done couldn't be undone, but it could be answered for. Justice was coming. But more than that, something else was coming too. Something none of them expected. Something that would turn this nightmare flight into the first day of Doris Williams's new life. Linda Ferow held Doris Williams like she was made of glass, like if she let go this child might shatter into 1,000 pieces. Doris sobbed into Linda's shoulder, her whole body shaking with 4 months of accumulated grief, and Linda just held her, rocking gently, making soft sounds of comfort that required no words because words couldn't fix this kind of pain. Alexander Ferow stood watching, and inside him something ancient and familiar was rising. Rage. The kind of cold, focused rage that had fueled him through a childhood of being unwanted, through nights sleeping in his car, through every obstacle that had tried to crush him. But this rage wasn't for himself. It was for this 7-year-old girl who'd lost everything and then been kicked while she was down by someone who was supposed to keep her safe. He turned to Diana Coleman, and when he spoke, his voice was so cold it could have frozen water. "Give me your supervisor." "No." Diana's face was already pale, but it went a shade whiter. She tried to recover her professional composure, tried to smile, tried to smooth this over the way she'd smoothed over 100 other complaints from passengers who eventually just gave up and moved on. "Sir, I assure you this is all a misunderstanding. If you'll just allow me to explain." Alexander cut her off, and every word was precisely enunciated, sharp as broken glass. "I said now. Or I'll have my attorneys contact your airline before we land. And trust me, you don't want that. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise." And Diana Coleman, who'd spent 10 years dealing with angry passengers, who'd learned to deflect and defer and delay, realized instantly that this was different. This man wasn't bluffing. This man had the resources to follow through. This man was dangerous in ways she'd never encountered before. She retreated, visibly shaken, stumbling slightly as she backed away, and practically ran toward the front galley to call for help. Her career was over. She knew it. Everyone watching knew it. But knowing it and accepting it are two different things, and Diana would spend the rest of the flight trying desperately to salvage the unsalvageable. Gabriella didn't care about Diana anymore. Diana was irrelevant. Diana was yesterday's problem. Gabriella cared about Doris, who was still crying, still broken, still so deeply wounded that even her mother's warm embrace couldn't quite reach the pain. Gabriella sat down in the empty seat next to Doris, the seat she'd claimed, and she reached out and took Doris's small hand in hers. Doris's hand was cold, shaking, and Gabriella held it tight, trying to transfer some warmth, some comfort, some sense that she wasn't alone. Linda felt Gabriella's presence beside them and adjusted her hold on Doris so both girls could be close. She kept rocking, kept making those soft sounds, and she whispered the words she'd whispered to hundreds of traumatized children in her social work career. "It's okay, sweetheart. It's okay. You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you. You're safe." Doris wanted to believe it. She wanted so desperately to believe that she was safe, that the bad things were over, that she could stop bracing for the next blow. But 4 months of foster care had taught her that safety was temporary. Adults said you were safe and then they sent you somewhere else. Adults said they cared and then they got tired of you. Adults made promises and then they broke them. But something about Linda's voice, something about the way she held her like she mattered, like she was precious, made Doris want to try. Want to hope. Want to believe that maybe, just maybe, this woman meant it. Within minutes, the head flight attendant appeared. His name was Scott, and he was everything Diana wasn't. Professional but warm. Authoritative but kind. He took one look at the situation, at Doris crying in Linda's arms, at the torn dress visible beneath Gabriella's purple hoodie, at the dozen passengers watching with expressions ranging from sympathy to fury, and he knew immediately that something terrible had happened on his flight. Scott approached carefully, keeping his voice gentle and his movements slow. "I'm Scott, the head flight attendant. I understand there's been an incident. Can someone tell me what happened?" Alexander, who'd been standing like a statue of controlled fury, turned to Scott. "Your employee, Diana Coleman, deliberately destroyed this child's dress and then blamed her for it. She's been cruel to her throughout the flight. There are multiple witnesses. Scott's face went from concern to horrified. He looked at Doris, really looked at her, saw the tears, saw the terror, saw the grief, and something in him recoiled. "I'm so sorry." His voice was thick with genuine emotion. "That is completely unacceptable. Completely. Can I get statements from the witnesses?" The businessman from row 24 stepped forward. "I saw everything." The attendant deliberately stepped into the child's path. The cart was positioned to catch her dress. It was intentional. The elderly woman from row 22 nodded vigorously. "She's been awful to this poor baby since we boarded. Treated her like she was garbage. Made her feel terrible for spilling juice. Refused to let her use the bathroom even when the sign was off." The college student held up his phone. "I have video of part of it." Scott took their names, their seat numbers, their statements. He was thorough, professional, and genuinely distressed. When he turned to Doris, he knelt down to her level just like Linda had. "Sweetheart, I am so sorry this happened to you. This should never have happened. Are you hurt? Do you need anything?" Doris, still tucked against Linda's shoulder, shook her head. She couldn't speak yet, couldn't trust her voice not to break. Scott stood up and faced Alexander. "Sir, I want you to know that this will be reported immediately. This is completely unacceptable behavior. Our airline has a zero-tolerance policy for employee misconduct, especially involving minors." Alexander's voice was still ice-cold. "Apologies don't fix trauma. What are you going to do about your employee?" Scott didn't hesitate. "She'll be reported immediately to corporate and to the FAA. She'll be reassigned to the rear galley for the remainder of this flight with no passenger contact. And I can almost guarantee she'll be terminated. This kind of behavior, especially toward a child, especially an unaccompanied minor in our care, this is inexcusable." Alexander nodded slowly. "Good. See that it happens." Scott moved quickly. Within 2 minutes, Diana was pulled from service, her face red with shame and anger and fear, and sent to the rear galley where she'd spend the rest of the flight in isolation, contemplating the ruins of her career. Scott returned with a warm blanket, cookies, and a glass of milk. He handed them to Doris with such gentleness it made Linda's eyes water. "For you, sweetheart. You've had a rough flight. These are on us." Doris took the cookies with shaking hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Scott looked at the Ferow family, at Gabriella sitting protectively next to Doris, at Linda still holding this child like she was her own, at Alexander standing guard like a sentinel. "If there's anything else you need, anything at all, please let me know immediately. You're in seats 2A, 2B, and 2C in first class, correct?" "We were," Linda said quietly. "But Gabriella would like to stay here with Doris, if that's acceptable." Scott looked at the two girls, hands clasped together, Gabriella's purple hoodie wrapped around Doris like armor. "Of course. Whatever makes everyone comfortable. I'll note the seat change." He left, and for the first time since this nightmare began, there was peace. Quiet. Safety. Doris's sobs had subsided into hiccups. She was exhausted, wrung out, but the panic had eased. She was still wrapped in Linda's arms, but now she looked up at Gabriella with red, puffy eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "For helping me. For the hoodie. For everything." Gabriella squeezed her hand. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're okay." Linda reluctantly released Doris and helped her sit up properly. She adjusted the purple hoodie, making sure it covered the torn dress completely, and she tucked the blanket Scott had brought around Doris's legs. "Better?" Doris nodded. She took a sip of milk, ate a cookie, and some color started returning to her face. She looked at Gabriella, really looked at her for the first time without tears blurring her vision. "You gave me your favorite hoodie. It's okay. I have more. But it had stars on it. You love stars." "I do." Gabriella smiled. "That's why I think you should keep it. To remember that even on the darkest nights, there are still stars." It was such a wise thing for a 9-year-old to say, so profound and perfect, that Linda actually gasped. Where had her daughter learned such wisdom? From her? From Alexander? Or was it something innate, something that couldn't be taught, only discovered? Doris clutched the hoodie tighter. "I'll take really good care of it. I promise. I know you will." And then Gabriella asked the question that would change everything. "Tell me about your grandma Vicky." Doris's face lit up, the first real light Linda and Gabriella had seen in her eyes. She started talking, slowly at first, then faster as the memories came flooding back. "She's really nice. She has white hair and she always smells like cinnamon. She makes the best peach cobbler in the whole world, like so good you want to eat the whole pan. And she has a garden in her backyard with all these flowers and there's always butterflies. Monarch butterflies. Grandma says they're good luck. She sounds really nice. I bet she's so excited to see you." Doris's smile faltered. I hope so. I haven't seen her in 2 years. We lived in Chicago and she lives in Atlanta and it was too far and too expensive to visit and now I don't know if she'll even remember me or if she'll want me or if I'll be too much trouble. The words came out in a rush, all the fears she'd been carrying, and Gabriella listened to every single one. Grandmas always want their grandkids, Gabriella said with absolute certainty. That's like their job. Being grandmas and loving their grandkids no matter what. Doris looked at her hopefully. You think so? I know so. My grandma lives far away too, but whenever I see her she acts like I'm the best thing that ever happened to her. That's what grandmas do. And then for the first time since her parents died, Doris laughed. Just a little laugh, barely more than a giggle, but it was there. Real. Genuine. They talked for the next 20 minutes about everything and nothing. Gabriella asked about school and Doris talked about how she used to like it but couldn't concentrate anymore. Gabriella asked about favorite colors and Doris said yellow like sunshine and Gabriella said blue like the ocean. Gabriella asked about favorite animals and Doris said butterflies like in Grandma's garden, and Gabriella said dolphins because they're smart and friendly. Do you like to draw? Gabriella asked. Doris's face clouded over. I used to draw all the time. My mom hung my pictures on the refrigerator and she said I was going to be an artist someday. But I haven't drawn since. Since they died, Gabriella finished gently. Doris nodded. Makes me too sad. Everything I used to love makes me sad now. Gabriella thought about this. Maybe it won't always. Maybe someday you'll draw again and it'll make you happy because you'll remember how your mom loved your pictures. Maybe. Doris didn't sound convinced, but there was a tiny seed of hope in her voice. What do you like to do? Doris asked. Science experiments. I have a whole lab set up in my room and I do experiments with my dad sometimes. We made a volcano once and it exploded all over the ceiling and my mom was so mad but she also laughed. That sounds fun. It is. Maybe when you're settled with your grandma, you could come over sometime and we could do an experiment together. The offer hung in the air, fragile and beautiful. The idea that this wasn't goodbye. That maybe they could be real friends. That maybe Doris's world could expand beyond grief and loss into something that included science experiments and laughter. Really? You'd want me to come over? Of course. Why wouldn't I? Because Doris's voice got very small. Nobody really wants to be around me anymore. I'm too sad. I make people uncomfortable. Gabriella's heart broke all over again. She squeezed Doris's hand tighter. You don't make me uncomfortable. You make me want to help you. There's a difference. Why are you being so nice to me? You don't even know me. Gabriella thought about this question, really thought about it because it deserved a real answer. Because you looked sad. And nobody should be alone when they're sad. Everyone deserves someone to sit with them and hold their hand and tell them it's going to be okay. Everyone deserves that. Especially you. I'm always alone now. Doris's voice broke. Since my parents died, I'm always alone even when there's people around. Not right now, you're not. 3 words. Simple. True. Devastating in their kindness. Doris started crying again, but these were different tears. Not grief tears. Not pain tears. Something else. Relief maybe. Gratitude. The overwhelming emotion of being seen, being valued, being told that you matter. Gabriella didn't try to stop the tears. She just held Doris's hand and waited, because sometimes tears need to flow, and the kindest thing you can do is let them. Up in first class, Alexander and Linda Ferow were watching their daughter through the gap in the curtain. They'd returned to their seats after making sure Scott had everything under control, after making sure Gabriella was settled, after making sure Doris was safe. But they couldn't stop watching. Linda had tears streaming down her face, and she wasn't even trying to hide them. Look at her, Alex. Look at our daughter. Alexander was looking. He'd barely taken his eyes off Gabriella for the last 10 minutes. I see her. When's the last time you saw Gabriella that engaged? That happy? That alive? Alexander thought about it. Thought about the last 6 months of watching his daughter go through the motions. Private school where she had classmates but no friends. Tutors who taught her but didn't know her. Birthday parties where children came because their parents worked with Alexander, not because they liked Gabriella. A big house with a lonely girl rattling around in it. She's been lonely, he said quietly. All the private schools, the tutors, the security. She has no real friends. Everyone either wants something from us or is intimidated by us. She's been alone in a crowded room for months. Linda nodded, watching as Gabriella made Doris laugh about something. And that little girl has no one. They watched in silence as Gabriella started braiding Doris's hair, carefully separating the strands, her small fingers working with surprising skill. Doris sat very still, eyes closed, a small smile on her face, letting someone care for her. We always talked about adoption, Linda said softly. Before we had Gabriella, remember? We talked about giving a child the kind of home and love that you never had growing up. Giving a kid a second chance. I remember. Alexander's voice was rough with emotion. Then Gabriella came along and she was perfect and we thought we were done, thought our family was complete. But Alex, look at that house. 12 bedrooms. A swimming pool. More space than 3 people could ever use. We have so much room. In our house. In our hearts. Alexander kept watching Gabriella and Doris. Watching them laugh together. Watching them heal each other in small, incremental ways. Linda, we can't just adopt a child because our daughter made a friend on a plane. That's not how this works. There are processes, procedures, home studies, legal requirements. Linda turned to her husband and her voice was firm. Why not? Why can't we? You were a foster kid, Alex. You know exactly what that system is like. You know what happens to children like Doris. You know the statistics. You know how many age out without ever finding a permanent home. You know how many bounce from placement to placement until they give up hoping anyone will ever choose them. Alexander was quiet, processing. Because Linda was right. He did know. He'd lived it. The grandmother, he said finally. Doris is going to her grandmother. She has family. She has somewhere to go. Linda's voice was gentle but persistent. Who she hasn't seen in 2 years. Who might be elderly, might not have the resources to raise a traumatized 7-year-old, might be overwhelmed by the responsibility. Alex, I'm not saying the grandmother doesn't love Doris. I'm sure she does. But love doesn't pay for therapy. Love doesn't pay for the kind of specialized care a child with that level of trauma needs. What are you suggesting? Linda watched Gabriella tie off the braid with a hair tie from her own wrist. Watched Doris reach up to touch it with wonder, like she'd been given something precious. I'm suggesting we at least talk to the grandmother. Offer help. Support. Financial assistance. Access to therapists, tutors, whatever Doris needs. And maybe, if the grandmother is willing, maybe we talk about something more permanent. Shared custody. Joint guardianship. Maybe, eventually, adoption, but with the grandmother always involved, always part of Doris's life. Alexander watched Gabriella and Doris laughing together, and he saw something he'd never seen in his daughter's face before. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Not the polite smile she wore at charity events. Not the practiced laugh she used with her tutors. Real happiness. Real connection. You really think we could do this? Linda reached over and took his hand. I think Gabriella already decided for us. And it was true. Watching their 9-year-old daughter care for this orphan child with such natural compassion, such instinctive kindness, such fierce protection, Linda and Alexander both realized that Gabriella had seen something they'd been too busy to notice. Their family wasn't complete. There was room for one more. Room for a little girl who loved butterflies and drawing and her grandmother's peach cobbler. Room for a child who needed them as much as they needed her, even if they hadn't known it until this moment. Alexander's eyes filled with tears, something that rarely happened, something he'd trained himself out of in all those years of surviving foster care. I was Doris once, he said quietly. Different circumstances, but I was that kid. Alone. Scared. Convinced nobody would ever choose me. And if someone had looked at broken, angry, terrified foster kid me and said, I choose you, you're worth loving, you're worth keeping, it would have changed everything. Linda squeezed his hand. So let's be that someone. For Doris. Let's choose her. What if the grandmother says no? What if she wants to raise Doris herself? Then we support her. We help her. We make sure Doris has everything she needs even if it's not with us. But Alex, we have to at least offer. We have to at least try. Alexander watched Gabriella show Doris something on her phone, probably a picture or a game, and Doris's face lit up with delight. His daughter had never looked happier. Never looked more like she'd found her purpose. Okay, he said finally. We'll talk to the grandmother. We'll offer help. And if she's willing, if it's what's best for Doris, we'll talk about making this permanent. Linda started crying harder, and these were tears of joy and relief and hope. She leaned her head on Alexander's shoulder, and they sat there holding hands, watching their daughter and their future daughter bond over cookies and milk at 30,000 feet. Both of them were crying now, silently, letting the tears flow, because sometimes the most important decisions you make don't feel like decisions at all. They feel like destiny. They feel like something that was always supposed to happen, and you were just waiting for the right moment to realize it. Gabriella looked up at that moment, caught her parents watching, and she smiled. Not a questioning smile. Not an asking permission smile. A knowing smile. A smile that said she understood exactly what her parents were thinking and she approved. And in that moment, the Ferow family, which had been 3, became 4. Legally it would take time. Paperwork, home studies, court dates. But in the ways that mattered, in the heart-deep ways that couldn't be measured or documented, Doris Williams became part of the Ferow family the second Gabriella took off her purple hoodie and wrapped it around a crying orphan's shoulders. Love doesn't always happen slowly. Sometimes it happens all at once, like lightning, like recognition, like coming home to a place you've never been but somehow always belonged. If this story is making you believe in the power of compassion again, hit that subscribe button right now because we're about to land in Atlanta and you won't believe what happens when the Ferow family meets Grandma Vicky. Are you team adoption? Do you think the grandmother will say yes? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this story is about to go somewhere even more beautiful than you expect. The plane began its descent into Atlanta. The seatbelt sign turned on. Passengers started gathering their belongings, stretching, preparing to land. But in row 23, Gabriella and Doris sat hand in hand, and neither of them wanted this flight to end. Because when it ended, they might have to say goodbye. And neither of them was ready for that. They had no idea that goodbye was the furthest thing from anyone's mind. They had no idea that waiting at the gate was a 74-year-old woman who was about to get the shock of her life. They had no idea that their lives were about to change in ways that would make this plane ride look like just the beginning of an incredible story. The wheels touched down in Atlanta. The plane taxied to the gate. And 5 people, 5 very different people who'd started this flight as strangers, prepared to walk off that plane as something else entirely. A family. The plane was beginning its final descent into Atlanta. Outside the windows, the city spread below them like a constellation of lights in the late afternoon sun. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their arrival, asking passengers to return to their seats and prepare for landing. In row 23 of economy class, Gabriella and Doris sat side by side, hands clasped together, neither wanting this moment to end. Because when the plane landed, when they walked off into the terminal, they might have to say goodbye. And neither of them could bear the thought. Doris had stopped crying. She'd eaten her cookies, drunk her milk, and wrapped herself in both the purple star hoodie and the blanket Scott had brought. She felt warmer than she had in months, safer than she'd felt since the night of the accident. But that safety came with a timer attached. It came with an expiration date. When this plane landed, Gabriella would go back to her billionaire family and her 12-bedroom house, and Doris would go to Grandma Vicky's small apartment, and they'd probably never see each other again. That's how the world worked for kids like Doris. Good things were temporary. People left. Nothing lasted. Gabriella was thinking the same thing, her heart heavy with the unfairness of it all. She'd finally found a real friend, someone who saw her as just Gabriella, not as the daughter of Alexander Ferow, not as the girl with money and privilege. Doris didn't care about any of that. Doris just cared that Gabriella had been kind when everyone else had been cruel or silent. But they lived in different worlds. Gabriella knew that. And she didn't know how to bridge that gap. What neither girl knew was that Alexander and Linda Ferow had spent the last 20 minutes making a decision that would change all of their lives forever. Alexander unbuckled his seatbelt in first class and looked at his wife. "You ready for this?" Linda nodded, her eyes still red from crying, but there was determination in her face. "More ready than I've ever been for anything." They stood up together and walked back through that curtain separating first class from economy. They walked down the aisle toward row 23, where their daughter sat holding hands with an orphan child, both of them looking like they were preparing for heartbreak. "Doris," Alexander said gently, "can we talk to you for a minute?" Doris's face immediately filled with anxiety. Her shoulders tensed. Her grip on Gabriella's hand tightened. Adults wanting to talk was never good. Adults wanting to talk meant bad news, meant changes, meant something terrible was about to happen. Gabriella felt Doris's fear and squeezed her hand reassuringly. "It's okay. These are my parents. They're really nice." But Doris had heard adults described as nice before, and they'd still sent her away, still made her move, still disrupted her life over and over. Nice didn't mean safe. Nice didn't mean permanent. Linda sat down in the seat across the aisle from the girls, positioning herself at their eye level, using every skill she'd learned in 12 years of social work to make herself non-threatening, approachable, safe. "Sweetheart, we'd like to ask you something important. When we land, we're going to meet your grandmother Vicky, right?" Doris nodded, not trusting her voice. Alexander remained standing but leaned against the seat back, trying to look casual, trying not to loom over this terrified child. "We'd like to meet her too. We'd like to talk to her about helping you. Both of you." Doris's brow furrowed in confusion. Helping how? It was a fair question. A 7-year-old's question. What did helping mean? Money? Food? A ride somewhere? In Doris's experience, help was usually something small, something temporary, something that made adults feel good about themselves but didn't actually change anything fundamental. Linda smiled gently. Well, that depends on what you and your grandmother need. Maybe we could help with school costs. Or a better house. And that's when Gabriella, who'd been listening to her parents dance around what they really meant, who'd seen them crying and holding hands and making decisions, decided to just say it. To put into words what she knew they were thinking but were too cautious to voice. Or Doris could come live with us. Like a sister. The words dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, sending ripples in every direction. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Doris's eyes went wide, so wide they looked like they might fall out of her head. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. She looked at Gabriella, at Linda, at Alexander, trying to understand if she'd heard correctly, if this was real, if she was allowed to hope for something this impossible. Alexander's first instinct was to backpedal, to manage expectations, to be the responsible adult who didn't make promises he couldn't keep. Gabriella, that's not exactly what we... But Gabriella, who knew her parents better than they sometimes knew themselves, who'd watched them crying and holding hands and clearly making some kind of decision, cut him off. But it could be, right? You said you always wanted more kids. You said our house is too big for 3 people. You said family isn't just blood, it's who you choose. She threw their own words back at them, words they'd said over the years, values they'd taught her, beliefs they'd instilled in her about what family meant. And they couldn't argue with her because she was absolutely right. Alexander and Linda exchanged glances. In that look was an entire conversation. Are we really doing this? Yes, we're really doing this. Are we sure? As sure as we've ever been about anything. What if it doesn't work? What if it does? Linda turned back to Doris, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Honey, would you want something like that? To be part of our family? Doris tried to speak. She tried so hard. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words would come because there were no words big enough for what she was feeling. Hope and terror and disbelief and desperate, aching want all crashed together in her chest, and all she could do was cry. But these weren't sad tears. These weren't grief tears. These were tears of overwhelming emotion, of a door opening that she'd thought was locked forever, of possibilities she'd never allowed herself to imagine. She nodded. Frantically, desperately, nodded over and over like if she stopped nodding they might change their minds. But then reality crashed in. The grandmother she barely remembered but was supposed to live with. The grandmother who'd said yes to taking her. The grandmother who was waiting at the gate right now. But Grandma Vicky, Doris managed to choke out. I'm supposed to, she wants me, I can't just. Alexander knelt down in the aisle, bringing himself to Doris's level, and his voice was firm and reassuring. We wouldn't take you away from your grandmother. She'd always be part of your life. Always. This would just be expanding your family. Making it bigger. You'd have your grandmother and you'd have us. You wouldn't lose anyone. You'd gain people. Gabriella jumped in, her voice excited, painting a picture Doris could see. You'd have 2 homes. And a sister. Me. We could share a room and do science experiments, and I could teach you to code and you could teach me to draw, and we'd go see Grandma Vicky all the time and it would be perfect. Doris looked at Gabriella, at this 9-year-old girl who'd defended her, who'd given her the hoodie off her back, who'd stood up to an adult flight attendant without flinching, who'd held her hand while she cried, who'd made her laugh for the first time in 4 months. A sister. She'd always wanted a sister. When her parents were alive, she used to beg them for a little brother or sister, and they'd smile and say maybe someday, and now someday would never come, except maybe it was coming in a completely different way than she'd ever imagined. Doris didn't say anything. She couldn't say anything. She just threw her arms around Gabriella and held on like she was drowning, and Gabriella was the only thing keeping her afloat. Gabriella hugged her back just as tight, and over Doris's shoulder she looked at her parents with such pure joy that Linda started crying all over again. Alexander stood up and put a hand on Linda's shoulder. We're really doing this. We're really doing this, Linda confirmed. The plane touched down with a gentle bump. The engines roared in reverse. The plane slowed, taxied toward the gate. Around them, passengers were gathering their bags, checking their phones, preparing to deplane. But in row 23 time seemed to stand still. When the seatbelt sign turned off and passengers started standing up, Doris finally released Gabriella. She looked up at Alexander and Linda with tear-stained cheeks and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you." Linda reached over and gently wiped the tears from Doris's face. "Don't thank us yet, sweetheart. We still need to talk to your grandmother. This is her decision as much as yours." "Okay." Doris nodded. She understood. Adults made decisions about kids' lives. That's how it worked. She just hoped, prayed, begged the universe that Grandma Vicky would say yes. They gathered their belongings and joined the line of passengers slowly moving toward the exit. Gabriella held Doris's hand the entire time. Doris clutched Mr. Buttons in her other hand, and she was still wearing the purple star hoodie, now her most precious possession besides the teddy bear. As they walked up the jet bridge, Doris's heart was pounding so hard she felt dizzy. She was about to see Grandma Vicky for the first time in 2 years. The last time she'd seen her, she'd been 5 years old, and her parents had been alive, and the world had made sense. Now everything was different. She was different. Broken and scared and grieving and desperately hoping that her grandmother would still love her. They emerged into the gate area, and Doris's eyes scanned the crowd frantically. And then she saw her. Grandma Vicky Williams stood near the windows, a small, elderly black woman with white hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a floral dress and sensible shoes. She had kind eyes, the same kind eyes Doris's father had inherited, and those eyes were searching the crowd with increasing anxiety. And then Grandma Vicky saw Doris and her whole face transformed. Worry melted into pure joy. Her hands flew to her mouth. Tears sprang to her eyes. Doris didn't remember deciding to run. She just ran, her small legs pumping as fast as they could carry her, Mr. Buttons clutched to her chest, the purple hoodie flying behind her like a cape. Grandma. The word tore out of her throat, half sob, half shout, and then she was there, throwing herself into Vicky's arms, and Vicky caught her, held her, lifted her right off the ground even though she was 74 years old and Doris wasn't that small anymore. Oh my baby girl, my sweet baby girl, I've missed you so much. Vicky's voice was broken with tears, thick with love, and she held Doris so tight it almost hurt, but Doris didn't care, she never wanted to be let go. They stood there in the middle of the gate area, holding each other and crying, and other passengers walked around them, some smiling, some wiping their own eyes, recognizing a reunion when they saw one. The Ferow family hung back respectfully, giving them space, giving them this moment that belonged only to them. Finally, Vicky set Doris down but kept her hands on her shoulders, looking her over like she couldn't quite believe she was real. Let me look at you. Oh, you've gotten so big. So beautiful. Just like your mama. Doris was crying too hard to speak, but she smiled through the tears. And then Vicky noticed the hoodie, noticed that it was too big, noticed that underneath it was Doris's floral dress and something wasn't right. What happened to your dress, baby? Did it get damaged? Doris hiccuped, trying to calm down enough to talk. It's okay, Grandma. Gabriella helped me. She gave me her hoodie. Vicky looked up for the first time, noticed the Ferow family standing a respectful distance away. She saw Alexander in his expensive suit, Linda in her designer clothes, and Gabriella in her jeans and t-shirt, now without her hoodie, watching the reunion with a soft smile. Vicky's eyes focused on Gabriella, and she knew immediately. She knew in the way grandmothers know things, in the way women who've raised children can read situations. This child had helped her grandbaby. You must be Gabriella. Vicky's voice was warm, grateful, rich with emotion. Thank you for taking care of my grandbaby. Gabriella stepped forward, suddenly shy, suddenly aware that this was Doris's family, Doris's moment. She took care of me too, Gabriella said simply. And it was true. They'd taken care of each other. That's what friends do. That's what sisters do. Alexander stepped forward, extending his hand. Mrs. Williams, I'm Alexander Ferow. This is my wife Linda, and you've met our daughter Gabriella. Vicky shook his hand, confused but polite. It's nice to meet you all. Thank you for whatever kindness you've shown my Doris. Alexander's face grew serious. Mrs. Williams, something happened on that flight. Something that shouldn't have happened. May I explain? Vicky's expression shifted to concern, and she looked down at Doris. Baby, are you okay? What happened? I'm okay now, Grandma. But there was a mean lady and she ripped my dress and Gabriella helped me and her parents were so nice and... Alexander gently interrupted. Mrs. Williams, is there somewhere we could speak privately? I'd like to explain the situation fully. Vicky looked uncertain, protective, but something in Alexander's face, something earnest and honest, made her nod. There's a quiet corner over there. We can talk there. They moved to a less crowded area near the windows. Gabriella stayed with Doris, the two girls sitting on a bench nearby but out of earshot, giving the adults space to talk. Alexander explained everything. The flight attendant's cruelty. The deliberately torn dress. The humiliation. The witnesses. The intervention. Diana's removal from service. His voice was calm and factual, but underneath was a current of controlled anger at what this child had endured. Vicky listened with growing horror, one hand over her mouth, the other reaching out to where Doris sat with Gabriella. That poor baby. She's been through so much and then this? On top of everything? Her voice broke. Linda spoke up, her social worker voice calm and compassionate. Mrs. Williams, Doris handled it with incredible bravery. And she's not alone. We're here. We want to help. Help how? Vicky was cautious now, protective, the way you get when you've lived 74 years and learned that nothing comes without strings. Alexander and Linda exchanged glances. This was it. The moment that would determine everything. Linda took a breath and spoke from the heart. Mrs. Williams, my husband and I would like to talk to you about supporting Doris. Financially, emotionally, practically. We'd like to help with therapy, schooling, whatever she needs to heal and thrive. Vicky's eyes narrowed slightly. That's very kind, but why would you do that for a child you just met? Alexander spoke, and his voice carried the weight of lived experience. Because I was Doris once, Mrs. Williams. Different circumstances, but I was a scared kid in the foster system who'd lost everything. I know what that does to a child. I know what she's facing. And if I can help, if I can make her path easier than mine was, then I have to try. Vicky studied him, really looked at him and saw the truth in his eyes. This wasn't charity. This was personal. Linda continued, gentle but direct. We'd also like to talk to you about the possibility of Doris becoming part of our family. Not taking her away from you. Never that. But expanding her family. Giving her 2 homes, more people to love her, more resources, more support. You'd always be her grandmother. Always be part of her life. But we'd like to be part of it too. As her parents. The word hung in the air. Parents. Adoption. Family. Vicky's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Doris, sitting on that bench with Gabriella, both girls watching anxiously, and she saw something she hadn't seen in her granddaughter's face in months. Hope. Joy. Life. I love that child with everything I have, Vicky said, her voice shaking. But I'm 74 years old. I live on Social Security in a 1-bedroom apartment. I want to give her everything, but I barely have anything to give. I can offer her love, so much love, but I can't give her the therapy she needs, the opportunities she deserves. I lie awake at night worrying about what happens if I get sick, if I can't take care of her. What happens to her then? Then let us give it together, Linda said softly. She wouldn't lose you. She'd gain a family. We'd gain a daughter and you'd gain, well, us. We'd be family. All of us. Alexander added, we have resources, Mrs. Williams. We have space. We can provide the kind of stability and support that Doris needs right now. But we can't provide what you can. We can't provide the connection to her father, the memories of her parents, the family history. She needs both. She needs you and she needs what we can offer. Together we could give her a real chance. Vicky was crying openly now. Why would you do this? You don't know us. You don't owe us anything. Alexander's voice was thick with emotion. Because someone should have done it for me. Because Gabriella has been lonely and Doris has been alone and somehow, 30,000 feet in the air, they found each other. Because I believe that family isn't just blood. It's choice. It's showing up. It's saying you're mine and I'm yours and we're in this together. And because it's the right thing to do. Vicky looked at Doris and Gabriella again. They were holding hands, leaning against each other, whispering about something, and they looked like sisters already. Like they'd known each other for years instead of hours. Vicky thought about her 1-bedroom apartment. About her fixed income. About her age. About waking up in the middle of the night terrified that she'd fail this child, that she wouldn't be enough, that Doris would suffer because Vicky couldn't provide what she needed. And she thought about these people, these strangers who'd witnessed cruelty and responded with kindness, who'd seen a hurting child and decided to help, who were offering not charity but family. She walked over to the bench where the girls sat. Doris looked up at her with those huge, hopeful eyes, and Vicky's heart broke and healed at the same time. Doris, baby, come here. Doris jumped up and came to her grandmother, Gabriella following close behind. Vicky knelt down, ignoring the protest in her old knees, and took Doris's hands. Baby, Mr. and Mrs. Ferow have asked me something very important. They want to know if you could be part of their family. You'd still be my grandbaby always and I'd see you all the time. But you'd also have them. You'd have Gabriella as a sister. You'd have 2 homes. What do you want, sweetheart? Doris looked at her grandmother, at the Ferows, at Gabriella, and for the first time since her parents died, she knew exactly what she wanted. I want all of you, she whispered. Is that okay? Can I have all of you? Everyone was crying now. Vicky pulled Doris into a hug. Alexander put his arm around Linda. Gabriella stood there with tears streaming down her face and the biggest smile anyone had ever seen. Yes, baby, Vicky whispered into Doris's hair. Yes, you can have all of us. We're all yours. Doris turned and grabbed Gabriella, pulling her into the hug with Vicky, and then Linda joined, and then Alexander, and they all stood there in the middle of the Atlanta airport, crying and hugging, a family that hadn't existed 2 hours ago but was now bound together by choice and love and the simple fact that they'd all decided that this broken little girl deserved everything. 6 months later, the adoption was finalized. Doris Williams Ferow, the name read on the official documents. Doris had wanted to keep Williams, keep that connection to her parents, and the Ferows had agreed immediately. She was a Williams and a Ferow. She was both. She was all of it. She lived with the Ferows in their big house with 12 bedrooms, though she'd chosen to share a room with Gabriella even though she had her own beautiful room waiting. The girls had moved their beds close together so they could talk late into the night, sharing secrets and dreams and hopes. Every weekend, without fail, they visited Grandma Vicky. Not just Doris but all of them. It became a family tradition. Saturday lunch at Grandma's, and Vicky would make her famous peach cobbler, and they'd eat on her porch and watch the butterflies in her garden. But it got even better than that. 3 months after the adoption was finalized, Grandma Vicky moved into a cottage on the Ferow property. A beautiful little house with a garden and a porch in her own space, but close enough that Doris could run over whenever she wanted. Close but independent. Family but not crowded. Vicky had protested at first, said it was too much, but Alexander had been firm. Your family now. This is what family does. We take care of each other. Doris was thriving in school. She'd started therapy twice a week with a wonderful counselor who specialized in childhood grief and trauma. She'd started drawing again, tentatively at first, but then with increasing joy. Her pictures covered the refrigerator now, just like they used to at her old house, and Linda displayed them with the same pride Doris's mother had. The purple hoodie with the silver stars hung in a frame on the wall of the girls' shared bedroom. Neither of them wanted to put it away. It was a reminder. A symbol. The thing that had started everything. Diana Coleman had been fired by the airline within a week. The Ferows had filed a lawsuit, not for money for themselves but to create change. The settlement money, every penny of it, went to create a fund for unaccompanied minors, to train flight attendants better, to ensure that what happened to Doris would never happen to another child. Alexander started a foundation for children in foster care and orphan children. He threw himself into it with the passion of someone who knew firsthand what those kids faced. The foundation provided therapy, education support, legal advocacy, and most importantly, worked to connect kids with permanent families. Linda returned to social work part-time. She couldn't stay away. It was in her blood. But now she worked specifically with families looking to adopt, helping them navigate the system, prepare their homes and hearts, understand trauma and attachment. She was brilliant at it. And Gabriella? Gabriella was no longer lonely. She had a sister, a best friend, a partner in crime. They did science experiments that sometimes exploded. They stayed up late talking about everything and nothing. They fought sometimes, the way sisters do, over whose turn it was to pick the movie or who left their socks on the floor. And then they made up, the way sisters do, because being mad at each other hurt more than whatever they'd been fighting about. Doris still had hard days. Days when the grief hit her like a wave and she cried for her parents. Days when she missed her mother's hugs and her father's terrible jokes. But now on those days she wasn't alone. She had Gabriella to hold her hand. She had Linda to hold her while she cried. She had Alexander to tell her stories about overcoming hard things. She had Grandma Vicky to remind her that her parents would be so proud of the girl she was becoming. She had a family. Multiple families. Overlapping circles of love that held her safe. 1 year after that flight, on the anniversary of the day they met, Gabriella and Doris went back to the airport. They stood at the same gate where Flight 447 had arrived, where Doris had run to Grandma Vicky, where everything had changed. They were both wearing purple hoodies. Matching ones that Linda had ordered custom-made with silver stars just like the original. On the back, embroidered in silver thread, it said, "You're not alone anymore." They stood there holding hands, these two sisters who'd found each other in the most unexpected way, and Gabriella said, "Best plane ride ever." Doris laughed, that free genuine laugh that came easier now. "The worst and best day of my life." And it was true. The worst because of Diana's cruelty, because of the torn dress, because of the fear and humiliation. But the best because it led to this. To family. To belonging. To home. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness creates the biggest change. Gabriella gave up a hoodie. But what she really gave was dignity, love, and the reminder that family isn't about blood or money or circumstances. It's about seeing someone who needs you and saying, "You're not alone anymore." Doris Williams flew onto that plane as an orphan, lost and terrified and convinced she'd always be alone. She stepped off as a daughter, a granddaughter, and a sister. And it all started because one little girl refused to look away when someone needed help. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about kindness, courage, and second chances. And remember, you never know when a simple act of compassion might change someone's entire world. Have you ever witnessed a small act of kindness that created a massive change? Share your story in the comments. The world needs more reminders that love wins, that courage matters, and that sometimes the family we choose is just as real as the family we're born into. Gabriella and Doris walked out of that airport hand in hand, two sisters bound not by blood but by choice, by a purple hoodie, by a moment of courage 30,000 feet in the air. And somewhere Doris's parents were smiling, because their daughter had found her way home.